Imagine facing a brutal Scandinavian winter with no modern amenities. How did the Vikings, without refrigeration or central heating, manage to not just survive, but thrive? This isn't about their famous voyages. It's about the hidden engineering secrets that preserved food for months, insulated their homes against deadly cold, and managed resources when everything else froze over. You're about to discover their ingenious solutions. When most people think of Vikings, they picture fierce warriors sailing across stormy seas, raiding coastal villages and exploring new lands. But there's a completely different side to the Viking story that hardly anyone talks about. Between all those famous raids and adventures, the Vikings faced a challenge that was just as dangerous as any battle: the Scandinavian winter. Life in places like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark during the Viking Age meant enduring some of the harshest weather conditions on Earth. Winters lasted for more than half the year. The days became so short that the sun might only peek over the horizon for a few hours, leaving most of the day in darkness. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing. The ground turned rock hard, making farming impossible. The seas froze over, trapping ships in ice. These weren't just inconveniences. These were life or death situations that happened every single year. Without electricity, central heating, or modern medicine, the Vikings had to rely entirely on their intelligence and creativity to make it through. And what they came up with was nothing short of brilliant. Their survival methods show us that Vikings weren't just tough warriors. They were also incredibly smart engineers, planners, and inventors who understood their environment better than almost any other ancient culture. The Vikings' most important winter survival tool was actually their home. The Viking longhouse was a masterpiece of practical engineering designed specifically for extreme cold. These buildings were long, rectangular structures, sometimes stretching over 100 feet in length. But size wasn't what made them special, it was how they were built. The walls were made from thick timber logs, which provided the first layer of insulation. But the Vikings didn't stop there. They covered the outside walls with blocks of turf, essentially chunks of grass and soil still held together by roots. This might sound strange, but turf is actually an excellent insulator. It trapped air and moisture, creating a barrier that kept the freezing wind from penetrating inside. The roofs were also covered in turf with thatched straw, which served the same purpose. Inside the longhouse, the design was deliberately open. There were no separate rooms dividing the space. This wasn't just about saving building materials. The open layout allowed heat to spread throughout the entire building. At the center of the longhouse burned a hearth, a fire pit that provided both warmth and light. This fire burned constantly throughout the winter months, and smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. Here's where things get even more interesting. Vikings often shared their longhouses with their livestock, particularly cows. This might sound unpleasant, and honestly it probably was, but it was also brilliant. Keeping a fire burning all winter long might sound simple, but it required serious planning and skill. The Vikings had to gather and store massive amounts of firewood before winter arrived. A single family might need several cords of wood. That's stacks of wood measuring 4 feet high, 8 feet long, and 4 feet deep, just to make it through one winter. But firewood wasn't just about quantity. The Vikings understood which types of wood burned best. Hardwoods like oak and ash burned longer and hotter than softwoods like pine. They carefully selected and stored their wood, keeping it dry in special structures to ensure it would burn efficiently when needed. The central hearth served multiple purposes beyond just heating. It was the cooking center where all meals were prepared. It provided the only light during the long, dark winters, though Vikings also used oil lamps made from soapstone bowls filled with fish oil or animal fat. These lamps might not sound like much, but they allowed Vikings to continue working on crafts, repairs, and other tasks even when it was pitch black outside for most of the day. Managing fire was so important that it was never allowed to go completely out. Someone was always responsible for maintaining the flames, adding fuel, and making sure the fire stayed alive. Letting your fire die in the middle of winter could be a death sentence. Vikings couldn't just go to a grocery store when they ran out of food. They had to make everything they gathered during the warm months last through 6 or more months of winter. This required multiple preservation techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated for their time. Smoking was one of the primary methods. Vikings built special smokehouses where they hung fish and meat above smoldering fires. The smoke not only added flavor, but also dried out the food and killed bacteria, allowing it to last for months without rotting. Fish, especially cod, herring, and salmon, were smoked in massive quantities. They also created something called stockfish, which is fish that's been dried in the cold air without smoking. Stockfish becomes rock hard and can last for years if stored properly. Before eating, it had to be soaked in water for hours to make it soft again, but it provided reliable protein throughout the winter. Salt was another crucial preservation tool. Vikings salted meat, butter, and fish to prevent spoilage. They also fermented foods, which is a process where natural bacteria breaks down food in a way that preserves it while also adding beneficial nutrients. Fermented fish, dairy products, and even vegetables were common in the Viking diet. Fresh from harvest, barley, rye, and oats were carefully stored in underground cellars where the cool temperature helped them stay fresh. These grains were turned into bread, porridge, and ale throughout the winter. Dairy products like cheese and butter were produced in large quantities during summer and fall, then stored for winter use. The Vikings' preservation methods weren't just random trial and error. Based on what we know, we can assume they developed these techniques over generations, carefully observing which methods worked best and passing that knowledge down through families. Viking clothing was far more advanced than most people realize. They couldn't just throw on a jacket and call it good. Their survival depended on wearing the right materials in the right way. Wool was the Vikings' secret weapon against the cold. Unlike many other fabrics, wool stays warm even when it gets wet. This was crucial in the damp Scandinavian climate, where snow and moisture were constant threats. Viking women spent a huge portion of their time producing wool cloth. They raised sheep, sheared them, cleaned and combed the wool, spun it into yarn, wove it into fabric, and then sewed it into clothing. The key to Viking winter clothing was layering. Men typically wore a long-sleeved wool tunic over wool trousers with a thick wool cloak on top. Women wore long wool dresses with an apron-style overdress, also with a heavy cloak. Both wore wool hats, mittens, and thick wool socks. But Vikings didn't stop at wool. For extra warmth, they used furs and leather. Skin, bearskin, and other animal furs were fashioned into outer garments that provided additional insulation against the most extreme temperatures. Leather boots helped protect feet from snow and ice. Making all this clothing was a never-ending job. Clothes wore out and needed constant repairs. This is why cloth making and sewing were considered essential survival skills, not just hobbies. Without proper clothing, you simply wouldn't survive a Viking winter. Even with all their preserved food, Vikings still needed to gather fresh supplies during winter. This meant hunting and fishing in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. But the Vikings had tools and techniques that gave them an edge. One of their most important inventions was skis. Yes, the Vikings were expert skiers, and this wasn't just for fun. Skis allowed them to move silently through deep snow when hunting animals like deer, elk, and moose. Walking through deep snow was noisy and exhausting, which scared away prey and tired out hunters. But skis made movement quiet and efficient. Skiing was so important to Viking culture that Ullr, the Norse god of hunting and archery, was also celebrated as a divine skier. For fishing, Vikings cut holes through the ice on frozen lakes and rivers. They used lines with hooks or sometimes nets to catch fish swimming beneath the ice. Fish were more sluggish in the cold water, which made them easier to catch, providing crucial fresh protein during the winter months. Vikings also used bone skates to travel across frozen lakes and rivers. These weren't the metal skates we use today. Vikings polished flat pieces of animal bone, usually from deer or oxen, and attached them to the soles of their boots. This could imply they understood how to use frozen waterways as highways, turning a frozen obstacle into a travel advantage. One of the most important Viking winter survival strategies had nothing to do with tools or techniques. It was about people working together. Winter survival was impossible alone, so Vikings developed strong community bonds and cooperation systems. Families often combined resources, sharing food stores and living spaces to maximize their chances of survival. If one family's food supplies ran low, others would help. This wasn't just kindness, it was practical. Helping your neighbors survive meant you had more people to help you when you needed it. Winter was also when Vikings focused on indoor work that supported the community. Craftsmen spent the dark months making tools, weapons, and household items. Women wove cloth and made clothing. Blacksmiths repaired metal tools and created new ones. Everyone contributed to building up supplies for the next year. Social gatherings were crucial for mental health during the long, dark winter. Vikings held feasts and celebrations throughout the winter, not just during Yule, their version of the winter solstice festival. These gatherings provided entertainment, strengthened relationships, and gave people something to look forward to during the darkest months. Storytelling was a major part of winter life. This is when the famous Viking sagas were shared, with skilled storytellers recounting tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were how Vikings preserved their history and culture, passing knowledge and values from one generation to the next. Vikings were constantly improving their tools and inventing new solutions to winter problems. Their innovative spirit is part of what allowed them to thrive in such harsh conditions. They created specialized tools for winter use, including ice picks for breaking through frozen surfaces, snow shovels for clearing paths, and improved versions of axes designed to cut frozen wood. Each tool was carefully crafted and maintained, because a broken tool in winter could mean disaster. Vikings also understood the value of planning ahead. Throughout the summer and fall, they prepared everything they would need for winter. This meant not just gathering food and fuel, but also repairing buildings, checking tools, reinforcing storage areas, and making sure they had enough supplies to last until spring. Their approach to problem solving was practical and efficient. When they encountered a challenge, they looked for the simplest, most effective solution. They didn't overcomplicate things, but they also didn't cut corners on anything that affected survival. So what can we learn from the Vikings' winter survival strategies? They show us that surviving extreme conditions requires more than just toughness. It requires intelligence, planning, cooperation, and constant innovation. The Vikings weren't successful because they could endure more pain than others. They were successful because they outsmarted their environment. Their layered clothing, insulated longhouses, preservation techniques, and community cooperation created a system where survival wasn't just possible, it was reliable year after year. They turned their harsh environment into an opportunity to develop solutions that were both practical and elegant in their simplicity. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more.